And we thought it would be a good idea to present on this topic for a couple of reasons. One, because the Modern Slavery Act, the Commonwealth Act, came into force at the beginning of this year. And we found in talking with our clients that a lot of our clients didn't really sort of fully understand what that legislation was about and how to comply with it. Now, the Act doesn't make slavery illegal. Slavery's been illegal, I'm sure most of you would know that slavery has been illegal for a really long time. It's in most countries abolished in the 1800s, right? The Modern Slavery Act is about something different. It's about setting up a statutory regime for reporting on modern slavery, and it sets up this requirement for large businesses in Australia. Modern slavery includes not only forced labour, but things like sex trafficking, wanted labour, or debt bondage and domestic servitude. And the reason why our government and other governments around the world have introduced this reporting requirement is really just to focus the attention of businesses on their supply chains so that they can identify and hopefully then avoid and not engage with suppliers who are involved in modern slavery. And hopefully, I guess the idea is that then by doing that will eradicate modern slavery around the world, or at least minimise it. And just to put into perspective the size of the problem of modern slavery, in 2016 it was reported or estimated that there were about 40 million people in modern slavery. And that was kind of made up of about 25 million people in forced labour and 15 million people in forced marriage. And I guess another little sort of stat is that 1 in 4 victims of modern slavery are children. So it is a big problem. It's a global problem. It's a social issue, and it's something that a lot of businesses should now have a look at and look at their supply chain to see what they can do to stop it. We're lucky to have 2 fantastic speakers today present on this topic. The first speaker that we have today is Jason Sprague. Jason's a partner, a colleague of mine in the corporate and commercial team here at Barnier Perry. And he'll be looking at the requirements for complying with the new legislation, the impacts that can have on your business, what happens if you breach the Act, and strategies for compliance. And our second speaker is Carsten Primdal, and Carsten is a consultant with Zoic. Carsten will be talking about how to understand, measure and report on what goes on in a supply chain, how to trust what you see and when to be sceptical about what you see.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome everybody. Good turnout today. So this is clearly a topic which is very relevant and in most people's minds, particularly for those compliance managers who are out there. So I'll look at what is modern slavery, just in a very brief context, look at where our laws have come from, how they've evolved, and look at some of the obligations that will face you in terms of compliance and some of the issues that you have to consider when looking at how to comply with the new legislation. Also, the supply chains, we'll look at that in a brief overview, because Carsten will look at some of the more practical aspects of supply chain management. So there is no universally agreed definition of what modern slavery is, but it's essentially at its core, it's the deprivation of someone's liberty. In a slavery context, modern slavery, it means somebody can't actually leave work or refuse to work because of threats of violence and coercion. Under the Modern Slavery Act, they've actually taken the definitions out of the Crimes Act. So, Michael said, it's actually been a crime for quite some time, and slavery has been illegal for a long period of time. So the question comes of, why do we need to have something like the Modern Slavery Act? Now, the Modern Slavery Act also covers, by borrowing its definitions from the Crimes Act, does cover things such as forced marriage, and there has been discussion around, is something like forced marriage really something which should be under the Modern Slavery Act, or should be handled by other institutions, child protection institutions, family law institutions. So just on a bit of a side note, there is still an evolving dialogue about just how far the Modern Slavery Act is going to go and what it will cover. On a gender basis, 70% are female and 30% male, and 26% sadly are children. And of that, only 1% are ever rescued. So it's a very sobering thought to think about just the misery that is inflicted upon people by other human beings. So where does it occur? Well, there's a global phenomenon. It even occurs in advanced economies. Europe has about 1.2 million people in modern slavery. America is 2.2. But then you get to an area much closer to home, the Asia Pacific region, which has 2/3 of people in modern slavery, over 30 million. Well, that 30 million, there's an estimated 10,000 in Australia. Now, one of the reasons why the Modern Slavery Act is so important in Australia in terms of how it affects organisations is most of our trading partners are in the Asia Pacific region. We source most of our goods from there. So it's quite clear that if there's 30 million people subject to modern slavery, then somewhere in the supply chain you are likely to have a modern slavery issue which needs to be identified and reported on. Why does it occur? Simple, it's profitable. $150 billion in profits each year are generated through other people's misery. Most of that is in the sex trade, but when you look at where most of the slaves are engaged, it's actually in labour exploitation. The sheer number of people in those areas, in the supply chains, has made it a very prevalent problem which has been looked at and addressed at a global level. A sobering thought is the value of a slave. Back in the 1800s, slaves were very valuable, and all the laws around slavery there were viewed slaves as very valuable property. In 2009, that value was $90. It's probably even less now 10 years later. So it's a sobering thought to think about the value of human labour and slaves and even human life has been devalued so significantly. So where do our laws come from? Back in 1824, slavery was illegal. So it's not a new thing. The criminal code introduced other concepts of slavery, which outlawed those and made those illegal. Now in June of 2018, the New South Wales legislature passed a modern slavery act of its own. It was passed by both houses, but it hasn't received royal assent, and it has actually been parked for the time being. There were constitutional issues given that the federal government was passing their laws in November, which came into force on the 1st of January this year. And there's also concern about double requirements in terms of reporting. The New South Wales Act basically said if you report under another act and comply with that, you comply with the New South Wales legislation. But they're on a wait and see mission at the moment. We're going to see what happens in the federal level, see how it affects business, how it's applied and complied with, and I don't think we'll see anything out of the New South Wales legislature for some time. The one significant difference though with the New South Wales Act is it actually had pecuniary penalties. That is absent from the federal legislation. And that's one of the biggest criticisms of the federal legislation is if there's no pecuniary penalties, why will people comply? What's the point? Where is the impetus to actually make people adhere to the new legislation? So the genesis of the modern slavery laws in Australia is through international obligations. It's the federal government basically complying with their obligations at that level. It's driven by international standards of human rights, and the United Nations have a Sustainable Development Goals, and Target 8.7 specifically refers to the abolishment of modern slavery by the year 2030. So it's an ambitious goal, and it's something which is certainly a driver in terms of a lot of legislation being passed, not just in Australia but elsewhere, and there's a general rise in terms of consciousness and awareness of modern slavery as a problem and that it needs to be addressed. Now, fundamental to those are the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or the UNGPs for short. Now, there's three platforms or three fundamental pillars for that. One is the state's obligation to monitor human rights and remove human rights in relation to businesses. And the second is for businesses to actually undertake due diligence and deal with human rights issues in their business operations. There is a third pillar as well in terms of how do people report, how do people get relief and assistance in those areas. But we're focusing on the first two here. So from the federal government's perspective, they've passed legislation, so they've ticked their first obligation, the first goal is done, and they've pushed a a lot of obligation now onto business. But again, it's in compliance with the UNGPs. But fundamental to those UNGPs and the obligations on business is the concept of human rights due diligence. Now, human rights due diligence is all about looking at supply chains, understanding what's going on, addressing the issues, reporting on those issues, and undertaking processes to mitigate and abolish human slavery issues. It's a very broad concept, and this is what a lot of people are struggling and grappling with, just how far do we have to go? What are the things that we need to do in order to properly comply with the legislation that's been put in place? Now, the simple answer is it is going to take a while to work that out. So if you're hoping for tonight to get the exact way of reporting, it's not going to quite be that specific for you. Even the government themselves has issued a very short 100-page document about what you should possibly do with your modern slavery statements. So the government is also not really sure just how far it will need to go. And given that there's probably about 3,000 entities which they think will have to comply, I don't know quite how well funded they are to look at all those statements, but it's going to be an evolving process for them as well. And there is a 3-year period before we have to review, or before a review of the legislation will take place. So it is certainly a filling out period. And for those of you who will need to comply, I think there will be a fair degree of latitude given to you in terms of what the reporting is that's expected. So who has to who has to comply? Anybody who has a revenue of over $100 million and carries on a business in Australia. That $100 million threshold is about consolidated revenue in a group. So if you have a group which has various entities which might have a $20 million revenue, $50 million, $30 million, those particular organisations don't comply. But when you go up the chain to maybe the parent entity and consolidate that revenue, it's $100 million. So that parent entity is a reporting entity, and I have to report on the group. So you can see that in terms of the reach of the legislation and how it has to actually apply to the business as a whole and all your business units, it's very far-reaching. Now, I'm sure there's nobody, I don't think there's anybody in the room in the Commonwealth categories for 2 and 3, and also there is a 4th category for volunteers. So most people are going to think, if I have to volunteer, there is no on God's green earth I'm going to. It's too much work and too much effort. But there are possible reasons why you might want to volunteer. Now, in terms of reporting, if you are in a group, there are provisions to have consolidated reports across the group. That's also something which the Commonwealth Government has been looking at, and the discussions have been that maybe the Commonwealth Government will create one single consolidated report for all of government. That will be a very, very long document and a very interesting read, I'm sure. So if you have to report, if you're caught by the legislation, what do you have to do? You have to prepare a modern slavery statement, and there are 7 mandatory requirements in that statement. The first one is identify the reporting entity. As I said, when you sort of tick through who has to report, you work out where that threshold exists, and that's the reporting entity. Not too difficult to do. Describe the structure, operations, and supply chain of the reporting entity. The structure is fairly straightforward. You'll have your corporate trees, easy to identify. Operations is anything which generates revenue. So it's, again, a very far-reaching, broad aspect of what you have to put into your statement. And the supply chains are what feeds those operations. So where do you get your services? Where do you get your products? What feeds into it to make the operations and generate the revenue? The next one, describing the issues and understanding the risks. This is where I think most people have the concerns. Just how far do we have to go? What does it mean to actually explain what the risks are? In large organisations, you're going to have thousands of supply chains. Do I have to drill down through all of them? There is a concept in the UNGPs that it's about the higher risks, those that are most severe, that are taking priority. Doesn't mean you can ignore the lower level risks. It just means that there is an understanding this is a complex area. The things which are very clear, you need to probably put more effort into. That being said, the reporting regime is an ongoing process. When you have lower grade risks, there will be an expectation that as you report year on year, it will address those lower grade risks. is there's a difficulty in identifying risks. How do you identify that problem? How do you deal with that problem? So this whole process is an evolving process. Now, as I said, it's for entities with $100 million turnover or more. So the recognition is it's those larger enterprises which have the financial capacity to put these processes in place. That being said, that does come at a cost. And where does that cost go? Often to the end consumer. So there is a balance here in terms of putting obligations onto business and where the end cost of that comes to. Having said that, the view is that cost to the consumer is a low price to pay to stamp out the misery of human slavery. Now, one of the important things to think about with risks is there are three sort of levels. There's, do you cause the risk? Do you cause the modern slavery? Are you a contributor or are you directly linked? Now, if you're a cause or a contributor, there's an expectation that you will remediate or be part of the process to solve the problem. Now, if you're causing it, it's maybe you've got a factory somewhere where you know child labour's being used. A contributor would be somebody who goes to a supplier and says, I want you to give me the best price possible, knowing full well that there's probably going to be someone who's going to be subject to modern slavery conditions, but you turn a blind eye to it. In those two situations, if that arises, there is that obligation, expectation under the principles that you must do something positive to try and remedy that. If you're directly linked, that could be a situation where maybe you're building a massive skyscraper or something. You've got to source bricks. Those bricks come from somewhere overseas where there is a modern slavery issue. Maybe child labour is involved. Because you're not directly involved with that process but are linked to it, there's an obligation, not that you necessarily have to fix the issue, but the obligation is to use your leverage to try and say to your supplier, you're not doing the right thing. There are things which we would like you to do instead to try and alleviate some of these situations. So there's a concept of engagement with your suppliers, talking with suppliers, education, dealing with them in a way that tries to alleviate the slavery issue. Now, some people might say, well, look, let's put clauses into our contracts that say if we have any suspicion of modern slavery, we're going to just cut you completely. There is discussion around whether that is actually an appropriate response. Because one of the things which they are looking at are responses where you don't exacerbate the problem. If you have a situation where you say to somebody, I'm not going to deal with you, but you know full well that's not going to solve the problem, so they're just going to go to the next person and contract with them and still supply. The question is have you really alleviated the problem? If the answer is no, perhaps that process of cutting them completely is not the right one, but rather an engagement and education process. So again, these are probably raising more questions for you than answers because it's, again, just how far do we have to go with these things? How much do we need to engage with our suppliers on these levels? It's a very complex process. Describing the actions that you take. Again, what are the processes you're putting in place within your organisation? Do you have in place training? Do you have things in your contracts or clauses in your contracts which require your suppliers to meet certain conditions and obligations? These are the sort of processes which are being asked for that you report on in your statements. And that's really the heart of it. It's that due diligence piece. It's trying to work through seeing exactly what needs to be done to try and understand where slavery issues occur and how you deal with them. In terms of item 5, how do you measure the success? At the first level, it's very difficult because it's a new regime. We're not actually understanding necessarily how the measurements might work or how we're going to assess them. But over time, that will become clearer. And the typical thing is putting in KPIs. Do you have training programs? Have you gone through with all your subsidiaries and explained the situations, or your suppliers, and discussed with them the issues that might be at stake? That is an evolving process. I think in the initial reporting stages, that'll be a pretty general or pretty light touch area. 6, describe the processes with all your other entities. Again, if you're in a corporate group and you're reporting as a head company, you've got to explain how you're dealing with your subsidiaries in their processes, and it's a collaborative approach. So make sure that you're engaging with them to say, okay, here's what we need to do as a collective whole, as a group. 7, this is the bucket or the dumping area, if you will. I think this will be used by a lot of organisations to explain why they can't comply or why they have difficulties meeting certain requirements. And those might be very, very simple and standard issues such as, well, we can't get information out of a supplier, or the reporting in a supplier is just inadequate, or it's in an area where you just have no visibility. Again, those things will be, I think, the areas where you put your excuse about why, not excuse necessarily, but the difficulties you might find or face in trying to meet the obligations here. And that's going to also be necessary, because if you don't put those in and the Minister reviews your statement and says, well, what have you done for all these issues you haven't reported appropriately, he's then going to ask you to explain why these things haven't been done. So as I said, I think Section 7 will be that area of explanation, or please excuse me for this for the time being. We're working on it. So what if you don't comply? From a legal perspective, the answer is not much. There are no pecuniary penalties. This is a name and shame regime. And people think, oh, okay, well, gee, that's fine. That's easy. I don't really have to do very much at all. And that's true to a point. But ultimately, there is a massive groundswell of awareness and efforts being taken to look at these issues. And while this legislation has been passed, there have been other legal developments that indicate that even if you don't comply or don't have to comply, other legal remedies might be available to people as doctrines evolve to assess liability to parent companies. And already in the UK there's been a doctrine evolving where parent companies are being held responsible for their subsidiaries. Under the usual corporate veil arrangements, that should be quite clear where that liability stops and starts. But the way it's evolving, the claims that are coming through, it's very clear that that's now being eroded. Many years ago, when nervous shock was first brought in as a claim under tort, it was ignored, it was laughed at, it was like, it's not going to happen. But it ultimately did, because there was a pressure, there was evidence that it had to be brought into the law caught up. There is, in my view, a groundswell where that will probably happen over the next 10 to 20 years. So it's a watch this space. So public shaming, is that a big deal? For a lot of organisations it is. Public perception these days is very important. Social media is a very powerful tool. If you have a poor reputation for these sorts of things, it will hit the bottom line. Younger generations are much more socially aware. These are situations and concepts which are not foreign to them anymore. And if there is any issue, someone's going to raise it on Twitter, and it's going to go to the Twitterverse at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and then you're on the back foot having to suddenly deal with these things. There was a recent report, I think it was Four Corners, and there was an issue in China, I think it was Cotton On and Just Jeans, about their sourcing of cotton from China in factories which the Muslim minority was being essentially enslaved and compelled and forced to work. It makes front page news, it makes the evening reports, and people who are socially aware, and most people are these days, are quite prepared to put it out there. So it's not just a legal issue, it's a social issue. And that social issue translates into revenue and revenue loss. So again, why comply voluntarily at all? Well, good corporate citizen. There are those of you who want to take the lead, who want to actually be the flag bearers to say we are doing the best that we can and use that to your advantage. That can be a slightly cynical view. You are doing better than the next person. So in that social media perspective, it is something which you can highlight and flag. I suppose the risk to that as well is if you are saying those things, you must live by them and abide by them. There have been cases in the US where people have brought actions against certain companies, I think Nike was one of them, for misleading statements because they were saying that they were complying or their supply chain was free of slavery, and yet clearly it wasn't. Now that case ultimately settled before going to trial, but there are people who are using various other aspects of the legal system to put pressure on companies on these particular issues. So again, modern slavery, if you don't have to comply, is not going to necessarily go away as something which you need to consider and grapple with in business operations. So reputation, so it ties into that. Industry and peer pressure. Now, I spoke to the university group on this a few weeks ago, and the issue there is about, well, if one of your peers is doing it in that industry, do you need to follow suit, particularly in that context with students? Is it going to be something which is a marketing tool for students to attract students to your university? And you can say, well, we're doing this, but this university might not be. And again, that social awareness, particularly in the student area, is very powerful. The next one is staying ahead of the curve. As I alluded to before, there are changes in general law coming through. There have been many cases that have been basically in the last probably 5 years, which are trying to reach beyond the traditional protections, where I think it was a German case, I think it was a KIK case, where some people in a Bangladeshi factory were burnt, some people died, and they made a claim against KIK, who was the parent company, but had this sole supplier for clothing, and they were aware that the clothing factory was pretty dodgy. Now, the German court allowed them to actually bring the action. It was ultimately kicked out, but there are these cases which are coming through which are starting to identify particular issues which might be actionable. Now, one of the other things in terms of the developments in the UK for corporate parent liability is essentially there's 3 pillars to that. Do you have control? Was it reasonably foreseeable in terms of the classic Donahue and Stevenson test? And is the damage that was occurred, is it related to the arrangements in play? Now, they're all 3 sort of fairly classic tests. You go, that all sounds very normal. But in terms of the way it's been evolving and developing, the control aspect is becoming quite is highlighted and often quite concerning. The modern slavery provisions are asking you to take on a role where you are asked to look at your suppliers, engage with them, create arrangements to try and remove the issues around modern slavery. But a lot of the other cases are looking at, well, how much control do you have over your supplier? If that control element is high, is there a potential risk of liability? And potentially there is. One of the cases, I think it was the Walmart case that was brought in the US, there was an argument to say that Walmart had a contract with one of its suppliers. In that contract were obligations in terms of human resources, but also in how the labour was looked after, and also safety requirements within the factory. The only thing which saved Walmart in that instance was, while they had a right to look at these things, there was not an obligation. And the court said that contractual obligation is very different because it was up to them to enforce those things. But the question is asked is, if you are enforcing those things, if you are going to these businesses, if you are enforcing these rights, does that then create the relevant degree of proximity? Does that create a nexus that maybe under these tortious actions there could be a liability which is developing? I think that's a big concern in terms of general law. So while modern slavery laws are being put in place, and even if you don't have to comply, these general laws which are starting to evolve are still going to potentially bite. And I think that's where people have to consider more broadly the fact that they have to deal with the modern slavery issues. So, again, how far do you need to go? That is the million-dollar question. It will depend on the size of your business. It will depend on what you are engaging in, number of supply chains. Where is the high-risk issues for you? Certainly, if you are in a service industry, maybe you could argue it's probably going to be a lower issue than if you're in a mining industry. So the 96-page guidance booklet from the federal government. So it's quite clear it's not the easiest thing to comply with. There's a lot of work involved, and it really does take effort and a lot of people's time, energy and resources to make it a worthwhile process. Training, due diligence, and these are things that I keep repeating. It's a whole of organisation requirement. How are you engaging with people in your organisation? How are you engaging with your suppliers? How does it all connect? Where is the education piece? Where do you need to draw the line? Again, I don't have an answer for you because even the government at this stage does not really know. Over the next 3 years, we're going to have a situation where the government is assessing what they're doing. But one thing which I will say is that while the Act currently has no pecuniary penalties, and we model legislation on the UK. The UK had the same thing. For the first 3 years, there was no pecuniary penalties. They've had a review. That review came out in March or April, and it saw that the reporting was quite poor. The recommendations that have been made are to bring in pecuniary penalties. Another recommendation that has been made is also to look at directors being liable or responsible for making sure their statements are compliant. And if you fail to do that, you may not be fit to be a director. These are the things which are coming through or being discussed now in the UK. In 3 years' time, we'll be having the same discussion. Already there is a groundswell to say why they're not pecuniary penalties. It's going to be a hot topic in 3 years' time. We will look at the UK. We'll look at other legislation in other countries. France has passed legislation which is very far-reaching in terms of how it imposes, imposes a vigilance requirement on parent companies and subsidiaries. Hong Kong, Sweden, the UK, New Zealand are all looking at legislation. The US has legislation in place under the Californian piece of legislation, Transparency of Supply Chains Act. Again, the reporting requirements are quite onerous. The reporting standards are quite low. But this is an evolving area. I think there's going to be acceptance that these reporting standards will be low to begin with, but there is a driver to ramp these things up, and they will happen over time. So this is really the time to say, we're giving you a chance to start to get your act together. We're going to work with you and try and hopefully create a system which is going to work. And it will, over time, it will build on itself. It will become a bit easier to hopefully manage. The early stages are always going to be quite difficult. But the two key points here are the Act does actually not impose a legally binding requirement to conduct due diligence on supply chains. And it sounds a little bit odd when talking about what you have to do. These are the requirements to meet the standards of your modern slavery statement, but doesn't actually impose a binding requirement to conduct due diligence. The other key thing here is you don't have to guarantee that your supply chains are slavery free. It's about a process, it's reporting, it's how do you identify these things. And there's even, they even talk about saying if you identify an issue, don't charge it like a bull at a gate and try and solve it. That may not be the right thing to do. Again, speak with the relevant authorities, speak with the appropriate people, but have in place some sort of action plan to deal with it if you do identify it. These things aren't easy, and there's going to be a lot of work to be done over time to get this right. As I said before, there's no clear threshold of what a severe risk is, and what the priorities are that you have to put in place, but the driver is that if it's a severe risk, they're the ones you need to address first. And your other risks, don't ignore them. They're still going to be, they need to be identified, but they can be at that lower level. And that's in that Section 7 section I mentioned, where you might put some of these lower risks, which you can't really do a whole lot about for various reasons. But over time, there's an expectation that that will have to change and you'll have to be doing something to address them. So some of the key products which are at risk of modern slavery. Electronics is the top one. Every organisation survives on electronics these days. So it's quite clear that there's going to be something in your supply chain somewhere that has an impact. Apparel and clothing accessories is the next one. Now, it's always been very clear in terms of the fashion or rag trade, just how much there are people in sweatshops and those sorts of things. But then you go down into food imports. The cocoa one is one which is number 5, but it's also one which has been fairly well documented in terms of people in the Ivory Coast, in very poor conditions, being forced to get cacao beans and then export them out to the Western markets. So given that these are the top 5, you can probably already say, well, 1 and 2, most of you are probably going to have products in that bucket. Just very quickly, reviewing supply chains, sort of a 3-step process. Identify your general sectors. If there are risk sectors, if you are acquiring product out of, as I said, with cocoa, or you're a electronics manufacturer and you're obtaining minerals from somewhere. I know Apple and IBM have looked at their cobalt sourcing over the last few years to try and make sure that the cobalt that they source is coming from mines which aren't imposing slavery conditions. What are the products that you've got? What are the services that you've got in terms of your business operations? And then identify those areas in your supply chains which have visibility. which are probably your high risk and easy ones to deal with, and then go through that list and make it's almost grading them from the old stoplight from red to green in terms of what is higher and lower risk. Ongoing process, these are just basically overview of the things that you'll need to think about and consider. Relationship management, due diligence is ongoing, governance within your organisation. On the governance point, a modern slavery statement must be signed off by basically the head of your board or the head of operations. And that's where it's important for them, given that there's been talks about this personal liability of directors already in the UK, how that can flow through. So if you're reporting to a board, a large organisation, it's potentially an issue which, if they're the ones who have to sign off on the statement, it has to comply. And if it doesn't, is there a time in the future where that's going to really be a major concern, a major risk factor for a director? Training, monitoring and reporting, all those things just have to be embedded into the processes that you have. So they're the basic takeaway points. $100 million or more, you have to comply. If you're under it, you don't, but you may want to, given that this isn't going to go away. It's going to be something which does evolve and may, under general law, become an issue for you regardless. What level of reporting you want to do? We don't really know. The government will work through it over the next 3 years. The government, I don't think, will be eager to necessarily name and shame a whole lot of people on year one, because they're also going to be assessing what the levels of requirement are needed. And by the way, if you do have the minister come to you and ask for explanations and then they're not satisfied and are going to name and shame you, you can appeal the minister's decision to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. So even that process itself gives you some backstops in terms of stopping your name being put up in lights as a non-compliant entity. Risk assessment, reporting entities, just basically summarising what we've covered previously, and no Qnary penalties but a name and shame regime. And just the key takeaways, you don't have to verify that your supply chains are slavery free. You just have to be shown to be doing something about it, identifying what they are and what steps you are taking to try and make and try and remove slavery from those supply chains. I know it's been very high level. I'm happy to take questions after Carsten has spoken at the end of it, and if you've got some more detailed examples or questions to answer, I'm happy to do that. But I'll pass on to Carsten now, and you can look at the more practical issues around supply chains and the supply chain review.
Thank you, Jason. Just before we get started, I want to say I'm really honoured to be here. I think there's an amazing turnout. That's really great. It also shows how important this issue is becoming for more and more businesses and people. Based on my experience, I assume that most of you are here to hear a little bit about how you are going to address the risk in your supply chain and how you can actually report on what is going on there. So that's what I've been trying to focus my presentation on. But before going into the actual presentation, I want to say that this Modern Slavery Act is about the slaves. So it's really important that we remember that these are people who are suffering unbearable working conditions, and that is the purpose that we're working to solve. The next point I want to say is that it's important to understand that it is possible to know your supply chain well enough and get an understanding that allow you to meet your reporting obligations. Excuse me. According to the Modern Slavery Act. Applying the right method will make your reporting better, and it'll increase your transparency and demonstrate that there's a method to what it is that you're trying to communicate. I don't have any photos of slaves, partly because that is not how it works. You don't see slaves most of the time. I've seen child labor, which is also classified as slavery, but I haven't seen the worst types of child labor. And generally speaking, you don't make photos of people in that kind of condition. So that's not what I'm going to show you, but I am going to show you a couple of small video clips that I've filmed in factories and photos that show the reality on the ground. So this is a presentation based on my own experience, working in China, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and seeing a fair few pretty appalling situations. I've also tried to alternate between relating it back to the Modern Slavery Act and the reporting requirements, the 7 mandatory requirements. So it's sort of interspersed with videos and small stories that hopefully serves to give you the message. And like Jason said, once you know, you can't unknow, right? It's pretty difficult to walk away. So nobody can claim ignorance once they've actually seen what's going on in the supply chain. So my name is Carsten Primdal, and I'm working in a company called Sprague. We're a sustainability consultancy. My background is working with sustainability in China and Asia. I worked with a number of factories, reaching plus 300 factories in China, not just once, but visiting them on several occasions, and done training, capacity building in China as well, and mitigated cases of child labor that I've found in my work there. So I specialize in sustainable supply chain, so that's mostly on the social side of things, like social audits. So I want to start with a little video here, which is just to show you the ambiguity of the situation in China when you walk into a factory. Essentially, you might have to look quite well. I did test it, but it's a bit difficult to actually see. But this is a factory that I was working with, and they... Oh, actually, I just start the video, and then you can see. So if you're lucky, you might be able to see that there's fish swimming around. This is an effluent treatment plant, and apparently it's so clean that the fish can live in there, and the guy's suggesting that I catch one and eat it for lunch. So there's something fishy there. Sorry for the pun. That wasn't intentional. You have to look pretty well to understand what's going on. So we walked behind the factory and had a look. This is the backside of the factory, and that's probably where the effluent comes out, I would suspect. So there's a lot of ambiguity to how these factories can be set up to almost deceive, convey a message that perhaps doesn't correspond quite to reality. And of course, once you realize that the situation can be like this, you also, it must raise the additional question that clearly they're trying to hide something related to environmental non-compliance, but what else are they hiding? So when you see something like this, you got to dig deeper, and that's that's what we got to do. So there's just really briefly to relate it up to the 7 mandatory reporting criteria. I'm not going to go into detail on all 7 of them. I'm going to focus mostly on the criteria 3, 4, and 5, the risks, the steps taken, and the evaluation of the effectiveness. So just to continue on the ambiguity in the information, this is a picture from a factory that I work with, another factory. So these ones, they make shoes, and on the face of everything, you can see that this lady is, she's the solvent that they're using to clean the shoes before packaging. It's labeled. You might actually not see it, but it is labeled. She's wearing PPE, appropriate PPE, personal protective equipment, and so is the woman next to her. But then when we zoom in, we realize that the glasses are upside down. and the mask is sitting so far down you can see her mouth. It's not covering her nose appropriately. This lady has clearly put on the mask just the minute she saw that I was walking through the door. And she's been in such a hurry that she couldn't put it on correctly. So, of course, she's not using this on a daily basis. And then you've got to ask yourself, again, what else are they not showing you? There's actually companies in China who rent out this equipment to make sure the factories have sufficient equipment that the workers can pretend. So these are just some additional small photos. So you just ask yourself, this picture here, it's a factory. They're making barbecues for Walmart, and they're welding obviously quite a lot because it's metal. But if you look at the face mask, he doesn't have a welding mask. He has a piece of cardboard with 2 holes for his eyeglasses, so that he can protect his face from sparks. But I don't know if sparks is the real issue here. I think it's probably the loss of sight that comes from looking directly at a welding flame. So this is clearly a huge issue. The same here on the left side. You just don't know whether all of this, it's actually offcuts from cutting the uppers of shoes, but it's just being piled up behind the factory, and you don't know whether they're going to ignite it at some point in time or whether somebody comes to pick it up, or because there's not a garbage collection system as such. So common way is just to ignite it, burn it off. But the previous photos are more related to OHS, occupational health and safety, so personal safety issues. But this is the real stuff. So the guy on the left is a guy employed by a factory to specifically timestamp all the time cards for all the workers. So you can see the stack there, and I caught him coming down the stairs and took this photo of him. And he's basically stamping all the workers so that they're compliant with the time. They've been working for 3 hours at that stage, but obviously you can't show all the hours, so they will have somebody to do that for them, or if they're using a software system, they might be able to go into the software system and manipulate the data. But that's obviously fraudulent. Over here on the right, clearly these 2 kids, they are too young to work. How old they are, I can't remember, but I don't think they're above 16. And 16 is the age for young workers in China. So clearly they're non-compliant on that front as well. So I guess the key point about these first couple of slides is that you can't evaluate the risk unless you actually go to have a look, because it's very easy to fill out paperwork that shows that you're compliant, but you got to validate it. So, sorry, I actually forgot a small story here. I wanted to tell you a little anecdote of a factory that I visited near Guangdong in southern China. And so it was a factory making shoes, and we walked in, and there was a table of about 10 people sitting there putting the glue on the sole so that it could be attached to the shoe upper. And there was a 10, 12-year-old boy sitting among the other people. And that person is clearly not working age, so what's going on here? And we could have taken a really hard approach to that, say that's child labor, you're disqualified, let's disengage, or recommend the client to disengage from this factory, but that's not best practice. So we looked a little bit more into it. There wasn't any other kids in that factory, at least not when we were there at that stage. And basically we realized that it was a school holiday season. The person next to the child was his father. And he had decided that he would take the child with him to work that day rather than leaving him at home and make some pocket money. And I think most of us have probably made pocket money when we were younger, so in that sense it's pretty similar actually. But we had to look into it, and we confirmed with the school, yes, it is school closing. We did confirm that this person was the registered guardian of this child, so it wasn't somebody who just brought in somebody else. But nevertheless, it's still child labor, and we had to confer with our clients, and what do you actually want us to do with this? Should we take a tough approach to it, or should we take a more lenient approach to it, or should we just say this was a mishap? So the issue with this factory, and this is a common issue in China, is that the management systems are perhaps not quite as advanced when it comes to managing these kind of issues. So the factory management was sitting all the way down the back of the factory compound. They would drive in the morning past the production halls without stopping, without looking. They hardly ever even looked inside the production line. So the managers inside, they were not educated enough to know about this. So say, yeah, well, this is normal, we can let them in. The guard at the front of the factory wasn't educated to say, hang on, you're a child, you can't come in here. So what do we do about it? Said, look, you've got to do a tour of your factory. It's your responsibility. You've got to walk around from time to time, check what's going on. You can't just claim ignorance in your own place. And the guard had to be educated on this as well. Oh. Well, this is the next point, actually in regards to documentation and management systems. This is a documentation system. This is a filing system, as you can probably all see. It's in another factory. We walked in and we asked to see the documentation in the production line in one of the halls, and they pulled out this milk crate full of documents and said, here, check it. And yeah, what do you say? It's pretty difficult to manage anything like that. I mean, the only good thing about a picture like this or a management system like this is that it's so messy that it's pretty difficult to fake. But that's probably the highlight of it. So, of course, they're not all like this. But in general, I'd say there's a lot of processes that are not replicated across all of the organizations or all of the companies who produce for various Western buyers. And if you see something like this, for sure it's an indication of an issue that you need to look into other than just like this, on a day like that. So this particular factory actually also had another story, because the manager thought that he'd come up with this really clever idea. Instead of paying salary to his workers on a monthly basis, which is what you're required to do, also in China, he thought maybe he could just deposit it into an ATM and then give the workers withdrawal cards for the ATM. And we're not talking about him contracting a bank to put it into his facility. We're talking about him buying an ATM and setting up his own system. And then, so he would be in complete control. No outsider would have access to that ATM. He would be in charge of when money goes in, and well, probably would run out pretty quickly, right, once the workers wanted to withdraw money. And I don't think he had a banking license either. So anyway, we said to him that was clearly not a compliant way of doing things, so he had to figure out another way. But it's not exactly debt bondage or withholding of salary, because we didn't see it get that far, but it's sort of this flip side of debt bondage. So in terms of all the different systems and all the different processes and standards and all that are out there, there's a lot of facilities available to help out. And actually, I'd like to make one point, that they're pretty much aligned with each other. So you don't need to necessarily choose one in specific and then think, oh no, what are we going to do with the other one? They're actually all based on, or mostly based on, the United Nations Guiding Principles, including the Modern Slavery Act. So you see, and this over here is ISO 20400. So say when it comes to, for example, risk assessment, That's an element in the guiding principles, it's an element in the Modern Slavery Act, and it's an element in the ISO 20400. So they do line up. They're not that much of a difference. There might be different approaches to what to do and how to do it. But say if you are compliant with Modern Slavery Act, you're well on your way to be compliant with the other ones as well. So, firstly, I'd say education, like before, where the factory was, the office was located down the back, and they never educated the line managers on how to check for children. So education is key. It's not just a necessary element; it's also a responsibility. So who takes on that responsibility can, of course, always be discussed, but it's probably a good idea that we as businesses here have some say in what's going on in the supply chain and say, look, this is what we actually expect you to do. Unfortunately, a lot of companies already do that, but always more that can be done. The Act says that you need to describe actions taken to assess and control the risks. So this next one here, this is a video as well, and it's sort of a bit of an indication. This is a metal factory. She's using a lathe to grind down metal pieces to the right size for whatever product they're making at that moment. But you can see the splinters from that flying everywhere. She's not wearing any eyeglasses or earplugs or breathing apparatus or anything. She does have an apron, but that's about it. This is a dangerous working situation. One of those splinters could take her eye out. So if a factory is run like that, even though on the sort of surface it looks okay, this is an indication of other things that should be looked into. So in order to actually look into things, you do need to have a sustainable supply chain management program. And I would say what's here is best practice. You do need to have some sort of process for a self-assessment questionnaire, SAQ. You do need to do supply due diligence, which means that you have to go, even if there's no legal requirement. I say, how can you actually report if you don't go? If you don't go, you rely on second-hand information, which can be dangerous. So that's not to say that a due diligence process have to be full comprehensive audit of the entire supply chain. In fact, I would say it probably shouldn't be. In fact, it's really, really important to understand what it is that you want to look for first, which is, of course, where you need to do a bit of a materiality assessment on what is the important points for you, so that you can define what are the risks that you want to look into and categorize it so that so you can do it in a controlled way. So I'd say this is best scenario, what we have here on the left-hand side. Could also say a minimum version of it is here on the right-hand side. I think you do need to have SAQ, a system that allow you to filter the risk into a process that allow you to allocate your resources where they're needed. You do need to go. You don't need to go to everybody, but you do need to go to some. And you do need to have a monitoring program, which doesn't have to be as comprehensive as an actual audit, but it'll cycle. And you do need dedicated resources. You can't just have somebody who has a bolt-on to their function, because it's a big job. So just to sort of quickly show a little bit about how I think you need a sort of a decision tree that can feed through based on a set of questions. So you would start with your SAQ that would result in an in-out decision. Then you would feed your suppliers into a range of processes, either comprehensive or minor or no need to look. And at the end of the day, of course, it's either about filtering them out or filtering them in, based on the profile that, and the risk that you're willing to take. So having a process like this is quite important. And then, again, I define it as this part here in the middle as being the due diligence process. Then if it's a supplier that you're onboarding from new, then you continue to onboarding, but if it's already an existing supplier, you can jump straight into the monitoring process and have some sort of a phase where you say this quarter we look at suppliers in China in this category, and next year we look at Bangladesh in another category, so that you do it in a structured and methodical way. Of course, when you define your risk, you need to look into what level of scrutiny you want to apply to your suppliers. And there's lots of factors that play into that. Are they direct or indirect suppliers of your final product? It's a little bit like Jason mentioned in regards to whether you have direct influence or indirect influence. What is the level of existing compliance with that supplier? Do they already have, for example, ISO 14000 certification, ISO 9000 certification? If they have these kinds of certifications already, it could be quite a good indicator that they already know what they're doing, and that will sort of could help minimize or reduce the risk level. And general ability to obtain information from them. If they're very, very tight on the information, then it's probably also a bit of a red flag. And then you need a framework. So you have to have some sort of a generic risk. You could have a generic risk monitoring based on category or geography or spend, or there's many different ways that you can cut and dice it. Probably a combination is a good way to go. And then you need to have some individual supplier monitoring, which again based on their risk categories. And I'm not advocating that you should have 10 different risk categories. Possibly one high, one low, and one that can wait is probably okay. And then, of course, you do need to go into corrective actions when you actually find something. You need to have a remediation plan. But again, it has to be risk-based. So I think the key point that I want to make with these last few slides here is that if you can't really report if you're reporting from a supplier who have an either non-existing system or a system that's full of gaps, or could even be fraudulent. I mean, in my time in China, I've seen so many factories running 4, 5, 6 different books, depending on who is actually coming to look that day. And that is a worry that they do that. So, but the only way to get around that problem is to go and have some trusted source on the ground. So a little bit about KPIs and metrics. So basically, I just want to raise a point. I think probably if anybody who's been to India or Bangladesh have probably encountered something like this. So this is a highly cultural situation. What is dangerous and what is not dangerous? Clearly, this is in Dhaka, and clearly this is the way they go about doing business. And the train will run through from time to time, and they move, and that's fine. It doesn't work here, of course. So the cultural differences are the cultural differences are of course okay. We need to respect those, but what happens once it's your supply chain? So this is a textile factory also in Dhaka, and I apologize, it's a little bit dark, but you can probably get the gist that it's really crowded. These workers don't have a lot of elbow room to move around. Over here is a sign saying that that's the emergency exit over that way, but the closeness of all these tables makes it almost impossible to get out. This could have been Rana Plaza, actually, the factory that burned down and killed 1,100 workers in Bangladesh a couple of years ago, but it wasn't. Another issue they have over there is that they often lock the emergency exits because they're afraid of theft, so there's no way to get out. And it's not the same factory in the building either. They actually usually have separate factories on each floor, so you don't know what's going on the other floors. So the other thing is that, for example, this lady here, she's wearing a face mask, which is, first of all, it's way too small. It's made from some sort of piece of piece of cloth she's found on the floor or something in a waste bin, and they're all wearing this kind of homemade PPE, which is clearly not compliant either. And yeah, you don't know how old they are. It's really difficult to assess. So this is a pen factory. If any of you have like a plastic pen, you might have it from this factory. It's the largest pen factory in the world. And this lady is putting the pens together. And I don't know if anybody counted, but she hammered 19 pieces in that time. It's 20 seconds. So in a full working day, just assuming that's whatever, 8 hours or 9 hours, that's 20,000 pieces that she hammers like that. If she works overtime, we're well over 20,000 pieces. And even though she does have a piece of wood taped inside her hand, I don't think that's good for the bones in the hand to make this many knocks. This is not a case of slavery, but it is again indicative of the situation in the supply chain, and this is something that even normal workers can be subjected to. And again, the Act asks that companies prescribe what actions have been taken to address and control conditions that are related to slavery. We can't just look at slavery, you need to look at the whole thing. So in terms of KPIs and metrics, there's the guidance for the modern slavery guidance for reporting entities have a lot of suggestions. I think I'd like to take it down to a slightly deeper level. The suggestions are very much related to measuring how much training you've been giving to procurement at headquarters and all that kind of stuff, but that's not where the slaves are. I think it matters a lot more to actually train people in the factories. So some KPIs that I've been looking into and would suggest could be due diligence, monitoring, inspections as a percentage of your category spend, volume, managed risk versus unmanaged risk, or industry benchmarking. These three are, of course, pretty high level because they're not factory specific, but you do need to go into specific factories as well. That could be, for example, how many factory workers were reached in the supply chain, either via partners or via NGOs or via organizations that help do these kind of trainings. For example, while I was in China, it's an estimate, but with the 300 factories I worked with, we tallied up and they had 125,000 workers. So I could say that I actually helped train 125,000 workers in China. Not that I directly trained 125,000 one-on-one, but they were in big hall settings and 300 factories. And I think that's the kind of metrics that you actually need to say this is what we did in the supply chain. How many supply visits, and from audits you need to look at how many minor, major and critical findings did you have and how did you solve it, how fast did you solve it, because at the end of the day that's what matters. I mean, if you find a child laborer, you usually have about 2 weeks to solve that issue, to remediate it. So speed is of the essence. And then finally, how many slaves were found? My guess would be that you're not going to find many, because they are there, but they're not going to show themselves, and they're not going to be shown to you. They see an Australian or a Westerner coming into their factory, and straight away they will clear out anybody who shouldn't be there, including slaves. So I'd say if you just focus on measuring slaves, then it's not going to work. There's so many other indicators that lead up to it that needs to be measured first. So I'd say it's really important to measure what matters, and this is not just the easy stuff, that's the hard stuff on the ground, and getting that information from your suppliers can be really hard. So the takeaways that I'd like to give you is that, first of all, before jumping into any type of program, you do need to understand your risk. That means you do need to have your materiality defined, and you do need to understand what kind of risk that your business is facing. You shouldn't rush into audits alone. Audits are an important component, but they're not the only thing. And you can very quickly spend a lot of money on audits that give you absolutely no information that you can use for anything. So hold the horses and do it in due time. Like Jason also talked about, there's a big piece of work in actually communicating and relating to your supplier, building up good relationships with your suppliers, because at the end of the day, this is about trust, especially if the whole thing is so ambiguous. You do need to build up that trust level, and the only way to do that is by communicating. And then I also said, I think there's a tendency to a lot of companies stop at the policy level, thinking that that's enough, and then expect that things are carried out. And that's, in a sense, that's what they do in a lot of Chinese and Asian factories. The manager will tell the worker once what to do, and then they will expect that to continue. But if we can't expect that to work in a Chinese factory, I think we probably can't expect it to happen, or to work here either. So policy level is clearly not enough, in my opinion. I also say that it's really important to get some practical experience of people who've been on the ground, because there is things that on the surface of things seems okay, but at the end of the day they're not. Measuring what matters. At the end of the day, again, this is about the slaves. It is not about just corporate metrics. Of course, there's a compliance piece to it, but we have a serious problem with slavery in our supply chains, and I would prefer to buy slave-free. So I think we need to measure what matters so we can manage it. Minimum system. SAQ, due diligence, and monitoring systems is an absolute minimum, and a dedicated resource. And it doesn't have to be necessarily full-time, but it can't be just somebody who has to do it beyond the normal 40 hours of work. So I think the last message I would like to give you is just to reiterate that understanding your supply chain is possible, and that will allow you to meet the reporting obligations under the Modern Slavery Act. So, thank you.
Thanks, Carsten. Thanks for sharing those stories and raising our awareness about some of the practices that happen in Asia. I found that really interesting, and I think just before, I know that we've kind of run over time, so I'll just throw open to questions. Do people have any burning questions? Yeah, and then I might just get Jason and Carsten to answer. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick one. Is there any requirement for the company's statements to be audited before they submit? No. So on that basis, given all what you've just said, how can we have any confidence in the quality of the data that's being reported? Yeah. Either because of companies just can't find out, or they're actually just like being deliberately deceptive.
Yeah, and that is a recognised problem in terms of the reporting, and those will be issues which will be assessed and dealt with as this evolves. And when you have you might have 1,000 supply chains to deal with, and you are going to have situations where you don't have visibility. But as I said in the reporting in that section 7, that's probably where you'll put those things where we've made an assessment, we can't get visibility, we haven't proceeded, and if it's a high risk, you might say, well, we think it's high risk, but we can't take it any further. And that's your obligation is done right there. You've identified the risk, you said we have a problem getting information, and that's it. But if you have the same response in the 2nd, 3rd and 4th report, that's where they're going to start saying, well, why have you not done something to try and remedy this? That's the building process.
I think I understand the answer to this question, but I'll ask it anyway just to clarify. You spoke about the threshold being companies with the gross revenue or the aggregated gross revenue of 100 million in Australia. If you are a subsidiary but you have over 100 million, do you have to report as well as your parent, or does the parent make the consolidated report, and that would sort of satisfy your own requirement as well, which obviously you've got to contribute to that report anyway?
That's right. You both have to report, but the consolidated report identifies both entities as reporting entities, and you consolidate that report. As I said, with the discussion with the Commonwealth Government is to try and make a consolidated report for all of government. There's going to be different sectors of government which clearly have their own individual thresholds. With a corporate group, there is that reporting relief, if you will, to say, yes, you can consolidate your report, but then it's that item 6 in the statement which says, how have you communicated those arrangements? How have you discussed it amongst your group to address the modern slavery issues? So you can either do 2 separate reports if you want, or you can consolidate it. And that would come from the parent company, the one which has the highest revenue.
I'll just take one more question.
Thank you for your presentation. Speaking in the context of a global company doing social audits, how well does the Australian requirement under those social audits under the Modern Slavery Act align with other global requirements when, again, those social audits are conducted perhaps at a global level?
I would say that Australia is probably playing a little bit of catch-up at the moment. There's a lot of standards out there that Australian businesses are starting to become members of and audit according to. But I think there's been a bit of a piggyback ride on, for example, SEDEX audits in the market. And in that sense, if there's a sharing of audit results, then clearly there shouldn't be much of a difference between the actual results of the audit. Having said that, the audit result always depends on the auditor who's doing the audit. So it might diverge between different auditors.